It began a little over a year ago as an argument between two top generals. It's now become a full-blown civil war, with humanitarian aid groups and the United Nations warning that Sudan faces its worst famine possibly in decades, the way things are going. More than 9 million people are at risk. This is an exclusive report at the border with South Sudan from France 24 correspondent Olivia Bizot.
Every day, about 1,000 people cross this border into South Sudan. They're fleeing the war that broke out in April 2023 in neighboring Sudan between the army and the paramilitary Rapid Support Forces, with the few belongings they have left. This family traveled for 5 days from Khartoum. They faced checkpoints and threats from both warring sides.
The RSF is threatening everyone in Khartoum. And if you leave your house, they'll take everything you own. Even if you just go out to get some bread, they'll beat you. Everyone living there is a prisoner in their home. You cannot imagine the horrors of what is taking place and the crimes they are committing. Nothing is left.
Asha, her 2 children and 4 grandchildren just got here. They're already being sent to the nearby transit center in Renk. They're among 9 million people to have been forced to flee the conflict, making it the world's largest displacement crisis.
It's my first time here. We're expecting difficulties, but nothing too serious. It's been good so far, and it's such a relief to not hear the sound of explosions and war.
Asha and her family finally arrive, exhausted.
Hello, how are you? If you have any problems registering or with anything, I'm here to help.
I am now feeling safe. I am sharing with you. Before, I wasn't able to talk. But when I remember everything that happened, I feel sad. The scars can still be found in my mind and soul.
This settlement was built to host 2,000 people. But it's now bursting with more than 25,000 refugees who are facing shortages of water, food, and shelter.
Now that we've arrived and I'm seeing all these people, I'm starting to get nervous. I thought the main challenge would be leaving Sudan. And once we were out, it would be easier to go abroad to another country with my children. But all of these people are hoping for that too. My expectations are quickly going down.
In an attempt to ease the pressure on this transit center, people are being transported to more permanent camps. It's 5:30 the next morning. Yassine is about to set off. He came here alone. His wife and his 4 children are still in Sudan.
I want to go to my barn and see what the situation there and whether it is suitable for my family to come there and stay with me there. I think it is better than here because this camps is well accommodated and everything is good than here.
While women, children, and the elderly travel by bus, the men are forced into this truck for the 12-hour drive along dirt tracks. The sun has already set by the time they finally arrive at their final destination, Maban. It was a difficult night for Yassine and the other refugees.
All of these people escaped war, and all of them need help. I hope that life will become easier for us. The important thing is for my family to be safe. They have already killed most members of my family in Darfur. Armed men killed them, raped them.
Trauma isn't the only challenge. There's a huge shortage of basic goods here, and most people haven't had access to health facilities since before the war. Because of a lack of international funding, aid workers are struggling to cope.
Children that are brought from Sudan, they came together with severity of malnutrition since the time they arrived. 70 or 80%, they are seeking medical assistance in the facility.
We meet Yassine again. He's being given a tour of where he will live by Majid, who arrived here a year ago. Yassine feels defeated.
I will try to find a fine place, to safe place for all aspects, security, education, good life, and then I will break them. But now I cannot bring my family here. Now I see it is not as I expected. It's bad or worse.
It's an impossible choice, living in camps full of hardship or living in a war zone. But it's a decision that Sudanese people will keep having to make, as it's unlikely the conflict in Sudan will end anytime soon.
With us to talk about it is Ruvendrini Menikdiwela, the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, Assistant High Commissioner for Protection, usually based in New York. Thank you for being with us here in our Paris studios.
Thank you for inviting me.
First, your reaction to that report, and of course the irony that a few years ago South Sudan had a civil war and people were fleeing north. Now it's in the other direction.
Absolutely. And it really is a dramatic situation right now because the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, my boss, is actually in Sudan and South Sudan this week to bring attention to this situation right now. And we have over 7 million Sudanese who are internally displaced, so within Sudan itself, but little over 2 million refugees, Sudanese refugees in neighboring countries, and you saw in South Sudan, but also in Chad, where there have been, I think, some 600,000 Sudanese who crossed into Chad since the beginning of the conflicts last year. And this is in addition to a group of refugees, Sudanese refugees in Chad, who had already been there for about 20 years now from a previous influx. So you can imagine that these countries are really facing a dramatic situation because these are also countries that have fairly significant domestic challenges, both socio-economic and political.
We can add the Central African Republic to that list.
Yeah, absolutely. And these are all countries that have, despite their internal challenges, maintained a very generous open borders policy and accepting all these Sudanese refugees, but with very little international assistance or attention paid to this problem.
We're looking at a map here where the focus has been the last few weeks, particularly with Hemedti's rapid support forces besieging at times El Fasher, raiding a hospital run by MSF recently. And yeah, it's the question, like you were saying, there's this distinction made, but is it a distinction between those who are refugees and those who are internally displaced?
It's artificial at best. I mean, there is a international legal framework which regulates the situation of refugees. So once you've left your country of origin and gone into another country, there's a whole international treaty that comes into play. Whereas if you're displaced within your own country, for precisely the same reasons, there's actually no international protection regime that covers you because you're still a national in your own country.
When you look at Sudan and that report by Olivia Bizot, she speaks to that engineer Yassine and that predicament. Do you live as a refugee in a camp that's perhaps unsafe, or do you live in a war zone? What would you say if you had Yassine in front of you right now?
I mean, it's very hard to advise these people because it's absolutely true. He's come and seen for himself how really bad the situation is for refugees in South Sudan. Not because the South Sudanese don't want to assist them, but simply because, as I said, of a lack of international assistance. You know, the government of France convened this conference on Sudan a couple of months ago, and a lot of donors came and pledged something like $2.2 billion in aid. But up to now, the refugee response appeal has been funded at 9%, and the humanitarian response appeal, so that covers also not just the countries of asylum, but also the internally displaced within Sudan, that appeal has been funded at 19%. So you can see they're egregiously underfunded operations.
Why?
Well, lack of interest, lack of prioritization,
Why isn't this more of a priority?
Well, Gaza is taking up a lot of attention. Ukraine is taking up a lot of attention. People tend to focus on what's happening in their own backyards. They don't necessarily focus on what they see as a conflict that's, taking place a long way from home. And unfortunately, these are also regions where conflicts tend to occur fairly frequently, as I was just talking about, a previous influx of Sudanese refugees 20 years ago who are still in Chad right now. So unfortunately, there's, compassion fatigue, the fact that there's a slight disconnect between the donors and these regions far away where all these really tragedies are happening on a daily basis.
The divided United Nations Security Council, surely this is not something that would impact Sudan directly, or are there these superpower rivalries surrounding?
I think, we are a humanitarian agency, UNHCR, so we don't really like to comment on political issues, but Of course, the 5 permanent members tend to take different sides on many of these major crises around the world. And I was serving myself in New York, as you mentioned, and I've never seen a council this divided and so polarized. And that's unfortunately having an impact not just on the political situation, but on us humanitarian actors as well, because we are unable to operate properly because of a lack of humanitarian access, as you saw in Sudan itself, a lack of humanitarian funding, and simply a lack of interest in obtaining any kind of political solution to these conflicts.
We're ahead in the summer months now in Sudan. What are your staff telling you on the ground when it comes to, like, how big is this risk of a major famine?
We have the World Food Program that's operating inside Sudan along with UNHCR and other humanitarian agencies as well. And they have been alerting us to this for a long time now. But they're saying come the next few months, there really is a very, very real danger of famine occurring, and that 2/3 of the population would be subject to this. And, this is really an urgent appeal that we and they and the Secretary General himself of the United Nations has been really making.
And let me ask you just a broader question. Ruvendrini Menikdiwela, you're in Paris for this World Refugee Day. What did you say there? You've been attending events at City Hall. Mm-hmm. We've seen the global warming, the conflicts that we've mentioned. This issue of what it is to be a refugee, is it different from when you began this line of work?
Well, I began some 30 plus years ago, so I'm really old in this system and in age as well. And yes, the world is a different place. When I started off with UNHCR, a refugee situation never lasted more than 5 years at most. But now we have refugee situations that are lasting 40 years or longer. The first Afghan refugees crossed into Pakistan in 1979. 45 years later, they're still there.
The people who are in that report, in that camp, what's their fate? Are they going to stay in these camps for a long, long time?
Strong likelihood is yes, they will probably remain in these settlements. We hope in better conditions for a long, long time. Eventually, we hope there will be a solution and that most of them will be able to return voluntarily back to Sudan in conditions of safety and dignity. But that solution is a long way off yet, unfortunately.
How many of those people can South Sudan kind of integrate, bring into to their fold?
Well, the problem is that there were a significant number of South Sudanese refugees in Sudan. You mentioned that as well, that early on the movement was in the opposite direction. So these South Sudanese refugees who were in Sudan for a significant period of time have now returned to South Sudan, not because conditions are auspicious for their return, but simply because of the fact that there is a conflict in Sudan and they can no longer stay there. So in addition to the Sudanese refugees, there are also a significant number of South Sudanese returnees who are coming back to their country of origin. So the government of South Sudan is grappling on two fronts, absorbing their own compatriots who are coming back after an extended period of asylum, but also trying to absorb this new influx of refugees from Sudan as well.
We have a world where everything moves faster than before. And when you have a crisis like this one, we get the pictures faster. And we also get the backlash faster. We've seen a rise here in Europe of an anti-immigrant sentiment, same as in the United States. As we have at the same time, growing global population, global warming, is it becoming mission impossible to have a sort of holistic view of these movements of populations in a crisis, which is what you do?
No, it's interesting because, yes, during electoral periods, refugees and asylum seekers and migrants tend to become demonized, instrumentalized, weaponized, part of the campaign. All gloves are off. They tend to become really the scapegoats for everything that's going wrong in society. But, every year around this period, we conduct this survey with Ipsos. And this year we did that with 52 countries, most of them major refugee hosting countries, where we asked them the simple question from, people on the streets. If a person was fleeing persecution, conflict or violence, would they have the right to seek asylum in your territory? And 73% of the people surveyed said yes. So it's true. In the media, social media, traditional media, you do see a lot of negative rhetoric around refugees and migrants. But then you have a silent majority that actually do say, yes, we would accept these people if they're fleeing persecution and conflict. So we take courage and heart from that, the fact that there is this, number of people still supporting us in our mission to provide protection and assistance to these people.
Ruvendrini Menikdiwela, many thanks for being with us here on France 24.
Thank you for inviting me.